Well, good evening and welcome back to this series, to the third lecture in this series. If you're really paying attention, you might note a difference on the starting screen, which is the end date, February 17th. So originally it was planned to be 6 lectures like last semester, which would have taken us to the 24th, but the 24th is actually Vardan's day. And there's going to be a liturgy at the cathedral here. And I was in the evening and I was actually asked to speak during that. So decided to just cut the series 1 week short. So we'll have this week and then 2 more weeks. And so, yeah, just a heads up about that. So if you were here last time, we examined the rise and proliferation of a new subgenre in the Armenian historical tradition, the chronicle, which takes time as its organizing principle and records past events according to the annual calendar. I attempted to offer an explanation for why this genre came into such prominence at precisely this time, suggesting that it may have been in response to the perceived sense of chaos and disorder brought about by the disruption to traditional Armenian society and the fragmented and diasporic condition of Armenians. The structure of the chronicle may have offered not only a sense of societal cohesion, but also provided a way to ensure cultural continuity and combat loss of memory, both felt needs in the absence of the Nakharar noble class, who until this time had traditionally been the preservers of meaning and memory in Armenian society. But the Nakharars were now largely removed from the traditional Armenian homeland. As discussed previously, a major factor in this disruption was the migration of Turkic tribes from Central Asia into the region and their conquests. And here you can see on the map just what a vast amount of territory they did conquer. The fortunate among the Nakharars moved westwards to places like Cilicia, where they settled and set up new strongholds and principalities, and then eventually founded a kingdom, thanks to an alliance with the Crusaders. So far, in the first 2 weeks, we've looked at some historians and chroniclers from the 11th to 13th centuries, looking in particular at the way in which they interpreted the appearance of the new power players in the region and the dynamic changes they brought to Armenian life, both lamenting the loss of the past and chronicling the opportunities that the new reality afforded, such as the establishment of a new Armenian royal dynasty in Cilicia. The 13th and 14th centuries are dominated by the appearance of yet another force on the scene. This formerly little-known people from Central Asia would soon spread so rapidly and over such a great expanse that between the 13th and 14th centuries, it became the largest contiguous land empire in human history. And here you can see a little map image, which represents the expanse of this new power out of Central Asia and across, as you can see, pretty much the entire Eurasian continent over the course of just the 13th century. And we're speaking, of course, about the Mongols. Perhaps the only conquest comparable to that of the Mongols in terms of both rapidity and geographic extent was the 7th century Arab conquest across the Near East and Mediterranean. As in that previous case, the strength of this new power hinged on the charisma of a singular man, Genghis Khan, who, like Muhammad, confederated disparate and warring tribes into one great united nation. And this map here shows the conquest carried out just in Genghis Khan's own lifetime, just during his rule from 1207 to 1227. So it gives you an idea of the incredible rapidity and remarkably large geographical territory that the united Mongol nation conquered and took control of under Genghis Khan. Now, the Mongol Empire has actually become a very popular subject of study in recent decades among historians, largely because of the way in which it can be seen as facilitating a pre-modern form of globalization after the period of the initial conquests. So what's globalization? Well, in an influential book called The Consequences of Modernity, the sociologist Anthony Giddens defined globalization as the intensification of worldwide social relations, which link distant localities in such a way that local happenings are shaped by events occurring many miles away and vice versa. So in other words, it's the interconnected nature of disparate places across the globe because of them being united or somehow sharing in the same network or administrative structure. Well, the Mongol Empire provided such conditions for the Eurasian landmass after the period of the initial conquests. And historians have labeled the 100 years between approximately 1250 to 1350 as the Pax Mongolica. During this period of relative stability, most of Eurasia was connected administratively and economically. Thanks to the large overarching administrative structure that the empire provided, during the Pax Mongolica, one could travel by land along the Silk Roads or by the various sea passages relatively securely and safely and pay standardized customs fees. And it's at precisely this time that two of the most famous travelers of the late medieval world made their long and epic journeys. Marco Polo, from Venice across Asia and back. And here on the map, you see his travel itinerary, which basically covers the extent of the Mongolian sphere of influence, and then some in terms of the south. And the second, Ibn Battuta, a Berber Maghrebi scholar and explorer, who was the most traveled man in the pre-modern world. And he also undertook his voyages at exactly this time. So you can see all across not just Eurasia, but also Africa. The same interconnected land and sea passages over which these two travelers journeyed enabled a significant increase of trade, commerce, and communication, the exchange of goods, ideas, and people across Eurasia. And here's just a little map showing some of the goods that were produced in different places, and just the idea that all these kind of materials were traded along the Silk Roads, and they start appearing all over the place. Well, one local example we could bring up of cross-continental interchange is the appearance in this period of Chinese themes and motifs in Cilician Armenian art, which reveals the connections between two peoples on opposite ends of the Asian continent during the Pax Mongolica. So here's a manuscript image. At first glance, it looks like, just the kind of thing you would see in an Armenian manuscript in terms of the design. But if you look a little closer, you can see up on the top here, and also here, dragons after the Chinese style of dragons, and a phoenix. And if you want to follow up more on other examples of Chinese motifs and themes in Cilician Armenian art, then you could reference the article by the art historian Dikran Kyumjian that's on the screen. So Armenians were by no means disconnected from these global developments during the Pax Mongolica. Quite the contrary. Despite being on the relative fringes in the far western reaches of Mongol sovereignty, their lives were greatly and directly affected by the new political reality. King Hatum I, king of Cilician Armenia from 1226 to 1270, seeing the great power of the Mongol Empire arriving near his own doorstep, sent his brother Sumbat, the same Sumbat whose chronicle we looked at last time, to the Mongol court at Karakorum to seek the suzerainty of the Mongols. In other words, please protect us and we'll ally with you and support you in your war efforts. So while there, Sumbat met with Kublai Khan's cousin, Mungay Khan, who recognized Hatum as his loyal servant and vassal, one willing to make common cause against their Muslim enemy in the Near East. And while there, Sumbat himself received a relative of the great Khan as his bride, and the two had a son, thus ensuring the alliance. It's very unfortunate that the part of Sumbat's chronicle, which covered his voyage to and his time in Karakorum at the Mongol court, does not survive, and so we can't read it. However, what does survive is a fascinating letter that he wrote in Old French to King Henry I of Cyprus while he was at the court, and we can look at this together to recover something of Sumbat's perspective at this early and critical period of negotiations with the Mongols. So he's writing this to King Henry of Cyprus. We understand it to be the fact that it is 5 years past since the death of the present Khan's father, Ogedei. But the Tartar barons and soldiers had been so scattered over the face of the earth that it was scarcely possible in the 5 years to get them together in one place to enthrone the Khan aforesaid. For some of them were in India, and others in the land of Chata, and others in the land of Kaschar and of Tanchat. Well, you saw on the map just how spread out their extent was, so you can imagine how long it took to get everyone together. This last Tanchat is the land from which came the 3 kings to Bethlehem to worship the Lord Jesus, which was born. And know that the power of Christ has been and is so great that the people of that land are Christians, and the whole land of Chata believes in those 3 kings. I have myself been in their churches and have seen pictures of Jesus Christ and the 3 kings, one offering gold, the second frankincense, and the third myrrh. So who's he talking about? Well, he's referring to the East Syrian Christians who by this time were flourishing in both India and all along the Silk Road, Central Asia, and as far even as China, and had churches there. And they were actually very influential with the Mongols, especially in this early period. Some of the Mongol Khans were married to Assyrian Christian women. And so Sumbat had a chance to visit some of these churches. He says, and it is through those 3 kings that they believe in Christ, and that the Khan and his people have now become Christians. And they have their churches before his gates, where they ring their bells and beat upon pieces of timber. And I tell you that we have found many Christians scattered all over the East, and many fine churches, lofty, ancient, and of good architecture, which have been spoiled by the Turks. Hence the Christians of the land came before the present Khan's grandfather, and he received them most honorably, and granted them liberty of worship, and issued orders to forbid their having any just cause of complaint by word or deed. And so the Saracens, who used to treat them with contumely, have now like treatment in double measure. And let me tell you that those who set up for preachers among these Christians, in my opinion, deserve to be well chastised. Let me tell you, moreover, that in the land of India, which St. Thomas the Apostle converted, there is a certain Christian king who stood in sore tribulation among the other kings who were Saracens. They used to harass him on every side until the Tartars, that is the Mongols, reached that country, and he became their liegeman. Then with his own army and that of the Tartars, he attacked the Saracens, and he made such booty in India that the whole East is full of Indian slaves. I have seen more than 50,000 whom this king took and sent for sale. Well, all this brings up interesting questions of religion in terms of the Mongols and the way the Armenians saw so much hope in perhaps making alliance with the Mongols because of this kind of initial openness, you could say, towards Christianity. Well, the question of religion among the Mongols is complex. Let's wait just a minute on that quote. Genghis Khan's son and successor sponsored houses of worship, not just for Christians, but also for Buddhists, Muslims, and Taoists. So the Mongols had a traditional form of shamanism kind of religion. And so they were open to kind of the religious ideas they encountered in the people they met. And there's some kind of, I guess, openness and even sponsorship of local religious practice. But it's more complex than that. So the Genghis Khan's own the successor of Genghis Khan, his wife, as I'd mentioned before, was a Christian of the Assyrian Church of the East, the same Christians which Simbad refers to in his letter. But lest we get too starry-eyed, thinking of the Mongols as motivated by high-minded notions of religious tolerance, we could look at the following cautionary quote by Robert Bedrosian, who specialized in this period of Armenian history. And he kind of dissipates this sort of overly idealistic notion of religious tolerance among the Mongols. So he says, Mongol religious policy was quite complex and underwent numerous shifts. For example, at the time of the census conducted by Arlen and Buka in 1243, Muslims were used to terrorize Christians. Yet in 1258, during the siege of Baghdad, the Mongols encouraged the Christians in their army brutally to exterminate the city's Muslim population. But in retaliation for the Caucasian Rebellion of 1259 to 1261, Mongols destroyed churches and the Georgian Catholicosate itself, and the Emir Argun, himself a Muslim, had the Christian prince Hassan Jalal tortured to death for failure to apostatize. Clearly, Mongols adroitly used the Christians in Muslim areas and the Muslims in Christian areas for espionage and maintenance of terror. So in other words, they were quite happy to sponsor kind of the religion of their allies or sponsor the religion of people whose, the opposite people they were trying to punish or war against. Well, later on, 3 of the 4 major khanates, these are the kind of administrative subdivisions of the once great united Mongol Empire. It's just too big to manage on its own, so you subdivide it. Well, 3 out of 4 of them embraced Islam. But during this early period, when Hatum and Simbad were at the Mongolian court, Christianity, if not in good standing, there was a lot of hope surrounding the fact, maybe these Mongols could become sponsors of Christians. This kind of turn towards Islam was unfortunate as far as the Armenians were concerned. The Armenians were actively involved in this early period in attempting to convert the Mongols to Christianity kind of definitively. That ultimately failed. And what also failed soon after was Mongol supremacy in the Levant, near the region of Armenian Cilicia. And this was even more unfortunate as far as the Armenians were concerned. But it's something that Simbad and Hatum, who later himself went in person to the Mongolian court, could never have predicted. At the time, Mongols looked like the greatest, strongest power, not only in the region, but that, the world had ever seen. But what ended up happening was the Mamluks in Egypt, who initially were slave soldiers, rose to power and delivered to the Mongols in the year 1260 one of the most surprising defeats in history at the Battle of Ain Jalut. And here you can see a map of the Mamluk Sultanate, or the extent of their power in the 13th and 14th centuries. Well, this was terrible for Armenians of Cilicia, who were loyal vassals of the Mongols and had been warring side by side with them against Muslims in the area. And so in retaliation, the Armenians of Cilicia were dealt a punishing blow by the Mamluks, which ultimately led to the decline and fall of the Armenian Cilician kingdom in the 14th century. But that's a story for another lecture. So Armenians were actively engaged in the world created by the Mongol Empire. And from our vantage point, we're in a privileged position to have several historians who wrote between the 13th to 15th centuries, which offer a valuable and fascinating perspective on the new power and the way they were perceived and engaged with by the Armenians. Before zooming in on a couple passages where we can see some more of this up close, let's kind of take a bird's eye view of these sources that we have in this period. This is just the historians. There's obviously other sources from this time. So in terms of the 13th century historians, you have Kirakos of Ganjak and Vardan Areweltsi. And they're going to be the two that we'll focus on tonight. So we'll talk about them in just a minute. Next, you have Stepannos Orbelean, who wrote a history of Siwnik. This is an incredibly important work. Siwnik, of course, is one of the major provinces in Armenia today, but especially in the medieval period. And he put into his history a ton of documents that otherwise would have been lost, and covers kind of the whole expanse of history, focusing on the region of Siwnik, where he was metropolitan or bishop. And it's an incredibly important source, not just for his own time, but also for the periods that come before him. So then there's Grigor of Akner. No one knows really much of anything about this character, but he was an Armenian from Cilicia. That much is for certain. And he wrote a so-called History of the Nation of Archers. And this is a way of referring to the Mongols, of course, because they rode on horseback with bow and arrow and were such great warriors in that way. And so all of these works have been translated into English. They're available either online or in book form through Sophene Books. Then there's a couple from the 14th and 15th centuries. So you have this fascinating work by Hetum the historian, again from Cilicia. This is the history of the Tartars. It was originally written or dictated in French, medieval French. Remember, the Cilician kings were kind of like dual identity, Armenian and French. It was initially dictated in French, and then it was translated to Latin and kind of diffused or published. And then later, a translation was made into Armenian. And that's been translated by Robert Bedrosian. You can get it through Sophene Books or find it online. That's an interesting work. Maybe we'll look at it a little bit next week. It's also about the Mongols. And then you have finally in the 15th century, the early 15th century, Tovma Metsobetsi writing about the 14th century, the history of Tamerlane and his successors. This kind of sort of takes us up to the end of the Armenian medieval historical tradition. He's sometimes considered the last of the medieval historians, and after that you kind of move into the modern or early modern period. He's writing during a time of great turmoil and kind of instability. He's constantly moving around, and this work is an important source for that period of time. So naturally, due to the limitations of time, we're not going to be able to cover all of these historians in detail. But fortunately, like I said, they've all been translated into English. They're all fascinating, and you can find the text online if you're interested. So for the rest of tonight's lecture, I'd like to focus especially on the first two historians, as I mentioned, Vardan Areweltsi and Kirakos of Ganjak, who in fact were schoolmates and associates. With these two historians, and we could perhaps add to them also Stepannos, Orbelean, and Thomas of Medzob, we can identify an Eastern school of historiography, which would be distinguished from that of Armenian Cilicia. So all of those figures mentioned lived and were associated with monasteries in the eastern portions of Armenia, such as Siwnik, or the area that was formerly known as Arlen, Caucasian Albania, essentially Artsakh. All of these figures were highly mobile, due in large part to the political instability of the time, but also voluntary mobility, as they traveled from one monastery to another. Both Kirakos and Vardan were born at the beginning of the 13th century and received the best monastic education available in their day. Both studied with Vanagan Vartabed, perhaps the greatest Vartabed of his generation, at monasteries in the eastern regions of Armenia. We spoke in the last lecture about the number of new last semester, and the last lecture of last semester, about the number of new Cenobitic monastic institutions that were founded in the 10th and 11th centuries. With the disappearance of much of the Nakharar class, monasteries became the central institutions for cultural, artistic, and intellectual preservation and production. As endowed landholding institutions, many were able to assemble vast libraries and were connected with one another in intellectual and spiritual networks, as is evident from the careers of figures like Vardan and Kirakos, who traveled widely and stayed at various monasteries for different periods of time. And on the screen, not sure if anyone recognizes it, but this is Goshavank in northern Armenia. This is where Mkhitar Ghosh was a monk at Norgedik. That's where Vanagan Vartabed studied under him. That original monastery was destroyed in an earthquake, and this is a new one that was built later. But Mkhitar Ghosh is buried here, and I had a chance to visit this monastery and his grave when I was in Armenia last, and very moving experience. So Kirakos studied here also at Norgedik, or what is now Goshavank. Vardan, I talked about voluntary mobility. He made a pilgrimage to Jerusalem and spent considerable time in Cilicia, where he participated in various theological and intellectual activities. For example, he was commissioned by King Hatum to write a grammar, and he also participated in the translation into Armenian of the important chronicle of the Syriac patriarch Michael. So you can understand how excited the intellectuals of Cilicia would be by a highly, highly educated and knowledgeable Vartabed coming from Armenia, the kind of exchange of ideas that you could have with him. Well, Vardan wrote what's called a historical compilation, and it's precisely that, a kind of compendium of highlights from biblical and Armenian history, proceeding from the creation of the world and the first man Adam, and going up until his own day. The work is not long. He covers all of that material in just 164 manuscript pages. And his selection of material gives us an idea of how Armenian history was seen by a 13th century monk and intellectual. So what was considered important to him and how it was interpreted. Reading the earlier sections of the history is fascinating for that reason. And it's interesting to compare, his take on historical events with maybe our own from today. But what's interesting most interesting for us for present purposes is Vartan's own visit to the Mongol court of Hulagu Khan, which he describes near the end of his history. Well, who was Hulagu? He was a grandson of Genghis Khan and brother of Mungay Khan and Kublai Khan. Among many notable military successes, Hulagu conquered Baghdad and founded the Ilkhanate of Persia. Through his mother, who was a Karaite princess who adhered to the Assyrian Church of the East, their form of Christianity, Hulagu was baptized a Christian at birth. In 1263, he summoned Vanagan Vartabed to his court. He summoned Vartan to his court to engage in dialogue with the holy man and hear what wisdom he might have to offer. And Vartan describes the visit like this. In 713, the great, that's of the Armenian era, so mid-1200s, the great Ilkhan summoned us. He brought us at his own expense and on his own horses, both us and the Vartabeds with us, our brothers Sarkis and Grigor, and the Archbishop of Tiflis, Derder. We saw that great man on the important days of the beginning of the month and their year in the month of July. It was for them a period of joy, lasting about 1 lunar month. With all their nobles, they all put on new clothes, each day changing into a different color, whatever they regarded as appropriate. Also present were all their subjects with many notable gifts, kings and sultans, such as in our sight, the king of Armenia, Hatum, and of Georgia, David, and the prince of Antioch, and many sultans from the regions of Persia. At our audience, they did not permit us to genuflect or to make obeisance according to their custom, on the grounds that the Christians, Arkawun, only worship God. Arkawun is the term that the Mongols used for Christians. They had us bless wine and took it from our hands. And the speech which he uttered was first this. I have summoned you so that you might see me and become acquainted with me and pray for me from your hearts. We gave response, and they made us sit and gave us wine. The brothers who were with us sang a hymn, and the Georgians offered one of theirs, and the Syrians and Romans theirs. So the fact that Vartan blesses the wine and offers it to the Mongol Khan is, of course, a sign of great respect that the Khan gave to him. And here you can see on the left a picture from a slightly later period, but the kind of entertainment and festivity that would take place in the Mongolian court. So he described the singing of different hymns from the various traditions of people there, and various entertainment and kind of banqueting rituals that took place. So Vartan says, for on that day they saw people who had come from every region, with the result that the Ilkhan said, you only did I summon. What is this sign that not before and not later, but on the same day, they came from all regions with you to see and bless me? And he himself proposed, it seems that it is a sign that God's heart is good toward me. We said, we too were seized by astonishment. The reason is what you said. So you get what's going on here. So according to the story, the Khan had only summoned Vartan because he wanted to engage in dialogue with this holy religious man. But by the time Vartan arrives, there's all these other leaders at the court. And the Khan is sort of showing them off and kind of bragging, look at all these rulers of other nations that have come to me. I only summoned you, because I'm interested in spiritual matters. But look at all these people that have come to pay me respect and request homage of me. Don't you think that's a sign that God must be especially favoring and blessing me? So then one day he said, I will have a private word with you. So the Khan and Vartan are going to go off and have a private conversation. So one day he made a great open space and removed far away all the army. With 2 men only, he spoke with us for a long time. From his birth and through his mother, he said he was a Christian. We are not strangers to love of Christians. Whatever you have to say, speak out. So what's he doing? So he's inviting this Christian monk to come to him. And what does he want? He wants him to speak truth to him. Why? Because it's so rare and difficult for a world ruler like that to hear truth from people. So you have all these political people, these political figures coming. What are they going to do? Oh, they're going to praise you. You're the greatest person ever. Please just, protect us, make an alliance with us, or something like that. Everyone's going to be fawning all over themselves all the time and just want to get on his good side. No one's going to say anything that might challenge him or just be truthful and honest because you're too afraid. So the only, if you think about the medieval West, or even you see in Shakespeare, like the character of the fool. The fool is the one who's authorized to speak the truth to the king, because everyone else is just going to say what they think would be pleasing to the king. But the fool or a holy man, a spiritual figure, they're going to be the only ones in a position to kind of speak the truth to the king, the Khan. So this is what he's saying: have boldness. I'm not unaware of Christian things. Give me some wisdom, essentially. He had seized my hands, and we said what words God gave us to speak. The more superior you are to other men, the closer you are to God. The throne of God is established through righteous judgment. God has given to every nation dominion over the world. Up to you, they were ravagers of the world and loaded the backs of the poor mercilessly. But they have died and weep before God. God took their power and gave it to another nation. If you care for the world and are merciful to the poor, God will not take it from you, but will leave with you what he has given. And what he wishes to give, that further he will give. Set such a man in your court as fears God and loves you, who will send back home happy the man who comes weeping in distress, and who has no petition or bribe, yet recalls him to you. Let the world see such a man who sees clearly, is not blinded by bribes, and who says the truth to you. So what do you see here? What's the message he's giving him? Do you remember from the first lecture in the series, Aristarchus, when he was giving his take on why the Armenian, cities all fell? It was because of injustice, unrighteousness, by not taking care of the oppressed, the widow, the orphan, the poor, and by being, always boastful and always wanting more and more and more, and not essentially being a good and righteous and just ruler. So Vardan is taking that basically biblical message that the prophets would give to the Israelite kings, and which Aristarchus gave in his own history. And he's speaking exactly that to the Mongol Khan, saying, okay, well, you're in a privileged and blessed position. That's the sign of God's favor behind you. But guess what? There's only one way that you can keep this kind of rule and power. It's by being just and merciful. And by making sure you have people around you who are committed to promoting mercy and justice in your realm, and aren't just there for self-advancement and self-promotion, taking bribes or bettering their own position. In such fashion, we spoke much. He declared, I have placed your words in my heart. How is it that you have spoken all that was in my heart and seemed good to me? God has spoken to you, has revealed it to you. We said, not so. We are sinful men, but we have read the books of men to whom God spoke. And the hearts of kings are in God's hand. God has revealed this to you without books. So Vardan saying, no, I'm just telling you what I've read in scripture, in the prophetic books of the Bible. but God's revealed it to you, meaning like it's in your own conscience already that as a ruler, you should act and operate that way. I'm just reminding you of, that little voice in the back of your head that would tell you this anyway. Then we said, before God, I have one speech to make, which God hears, and then you, in which there is no falsehood. He commanded, speak. I said, as many Christians there are, and Arkobun, by sea and land, the heart of each one is well disposed toward you, and they pray for you. He declared, I believe that this is so. But if the Arkobun are not on God's path, what prayers do they make for me? And if they do, when will God listen? Can a wretched Arkobun bring God from heaven to earth or not? You said that they live on God's path and pray. Our brothers are in conflict with us over this, that we respect Christians, and there are Christians in our house. They love the Muslims, and there are Muslims in their house. So you can see the kind of basically exploration of different religious traditions among the Mongol leadership. Then he said to us, why are you dressed in a sheepskin and not gold? So you're this great wise person. You seem like you should have been really successful in life. What are you doing going around in a sheepskin, looking like a homeless person? Shouldn't you be dressed in finery? When he learned that we were not a great man or a lord of rank, but a mere monk who voluntarily chooses this kind of lifestyle and habit, he declared, I shall honor you with a garment of gold and give you much gold. What's he doing? Will you take a bribe? Are you actually honest and true to your spiritual, mission and perspective? Or will you just respond to glitz and glamour and material things like everyone else around me? So what's Vardan say? Gold and earth are one to us. We desire a different benefit, which is appropriate to your majesty, mercy for the world. So he's saying, no, I didn't come here for that. It's actually true what I'm saying. All I want is you to be merciful to the citizens and people under your protection. But the Khan declared, I shall tie up a purse of very little money, merely as much as you would pay for incense for the church, so that there is no land where they say, how did the Ilkhan provide for him? What you said I shall do, and I shall send men who will oversee the world. Well, he's basically saying, okay, but you have to take something to go, at least take enough to buy some incense for your church. Now, when we desired permission to leave, he summoned us and spoke with us. In his hand, he held a balish, it's a gold or silver coin, and he had 2 garments sewn. We reminded him, Ilkhan, your money can be exhausted and your garment wear out. We requested gifts that are inexhaustible and unwearing. So remember, he's basically saying, don't forget when I leave what really the most important thing is. He declared, yesterday I carried out your words. I have had a decree written. Have it read, and whatever your heart needs in addition, have that also written. To Sakhaltu and to Shahabatin, I have entrusted your land and your persons. Whatever you say, they will do. We thanked him and left. Perhaps we seem to be writing this at a redundant length, but we have set it down as an aid to recalling the benevolent and kind-tempered great Hulawu, or as an example to others who may come after us. Well, I hope you found this episode as fascinating as I did. We could discuss it further after the lecture, but it really makes you think and wonder just how might things have gone, if the Mamluks hadn't have defeated the Mongols, if this kind of like close alliance between the Mongols and Armenians had persisted. Well, we'll look quickly also at Kirakos of Ganjak. So Kirakos' history is much longer and more elaborate than Vardan's, with even more interesting details of his own experience with the Mongols. His history begins with Saint Gregory the Illuminator, summarizing the Christian history of Armenia from the 4th century up until his own day. He also gives a brief history of the region of Caucasian Albania, where he lived, which summarizes much of the history of Caucasian Albania, which we read last time, or last semester. And he also writes a great deal about some of the notable monks and monasteries in his era, including the Vartabeds Mekhitargosh and Vanagan, who we've talked about already. He talks about Vanagan Vartabed and how he dwelt in a cave that he had hollowed out himself near the village of Lorut, and had also built there a small church and assembled many books. And many disciples gathered around Vanagan to learn from him and live after his manner of life. And among them was Kirakos. Well, they were there during one of the early incursions of the Mongols into the region. And they were actually captured by the Mongols. And so Kirakos and Vanagan and the other companions are taken prisoner by the Mongols and essentially have to travel around with them. And we're not going to read that chapter, but you all should. It's really, really fascinating, including the way in which they stealthily escape. But it took them a while to escape. And while Kirakos was with them, they noticed, hey, this guy knows how to read and write, and he seems really smart. Let's make him our secretary. So Kirakos says, they took me from my companions to serve their secretarial needs, writing and reading letters. During the day, they made me travel with them, and in the evening, they would bring us to the Vartabed with a pledge. Again, they would come and take me either on foot or on an unsaddled, untrained pack animal, and they did this for many days. Well, thanks to this experience that Kirakos had, he learned the Mongolian language and became an up-close observer of their life and manners. And in one of his chapters of his history, he gives an ethnographical-like description of the Mongols, which is one of the earliest, if not the earliest, and most important such descriptions to survive from this period contemporary with them. And so this chapter has long been of interest to scholars of especially Mongolian history. And back in 1963, John Andrew Boyle wrote an article entitled Kirakos of Ganjak and on the Mongols that included a translation of this chapter with a commentary. And let's kind of read it and look at it together because it's very interesting. So his chapter is called A Brief Description of the Appearance of the Tatar, which is just a word for Mongol. Because we wish to leave a memorial to the generations that are to come, for we look forward with hope to salvation from the tribulations which have encompassed us, we shall display to the curious something of their appearance and speech. They were hideous and frightful to look upon, having no beards, though some of them had a few hairs on the chin or on the lips. Their eyes were narrow and quick-glancing, their voices shrill and piercing. They were long-lived and hardy. When the occasion offered, they ate continually and drank insatiably. When it did not, they were abstemious. They ate all living creatures, clean and unclean, and they most esteemed the flesh of the horse, cutting it limb from limb and boiling or roasting it without salt. Then they carved it up small, soaked it in salt water, and ate it thus. Well, horses were incredibly important to Mongolian culture. The horse was their great war animal that they rode on and made them so invincible in battle. And they also ate horses to stay alive because they were nomadic mostly. Some of them ate kneeling, like camels, and some sitting. And when eating, they shared alike between masters and servants. And when drinking yumuz, or I guess this is Turkish, kumis, a drink, and wine, one of them took it into his hands in a large vessel, and having drawn some out in a small cup, scattered it skywards, and then to the east and west and south and north. And then he that scattered it, having drunk a little of it, offered it to the most senior person. So everyone has rituals that they engage in before drinking, whether you're spilling wine to the gods or just saying cheers and looking into people's eyes, so this is the Mongolian practice before drinking. And if anyone brought them food or drink, they first caused the bearer to eat or drink it, and then ate or drank of it themselves, lest they might be deceived by some deadly poison. They took as many wives as they liked, but they in no way spared adulterers with their wives, though they themselves had commerce with strange women indiscriminately wherever they found them. And they detested theft to such an extent that they punished it with the most evil death. And they had no religion or form of worship, but they used continually to mention the name of God. So Kirakos is obviously expecting, liturgy, churches, like that kind of thing. So of course, the Mongols had their own religious practice that was essentially shamanistic, so very, very ancient. But they didn't have the kind of like developed liturgy and rituals that Kirakos would have expected. Whether they thanked the being of God or called someone else God, we do not know, nor did they themselves. It's very funny the way he says this. But usually they said this, that their king was related to God, God having taken the heavens as his share and given the ear to the Khagan. For they said that Genghis Khan, the father of the Khagan, was not born of the seed of man, but a light came from the unseen and entered through the skylight of the house and said to his mother, conceive and thou shalt give birth to a son, who shall be emperor of the earth. And by this light, they said, she bore him. So this is a very ancient Mongolian oral tradition about the origin of the royal family. And it's well known from other later sources, but Kirakos's version of this legend, according to this scholar, is actually the earliest such version to survive in any language that references this legend. And notice how Kirakos says, this was told us by Grigor the Ishkhan, the son of Marzban, the brother of Aslan Beg, Sargis and Amira, of the family of the Mamigonians, who had heard it from a great man from amongst the great commanders, whose name was Rutunuin, one day when he was instructing young children. And when any one of them died or was put to death, sometimes they carried him around with them for many days, because a devil had entered him and was uttering many idle things. And sometimes they burnt him, and sometimes they buried him in a deep grave, and with him they laid his arms and clothing, and gold and silver, and whatever belonged to him. And if it was one of their great men, they laid some of his men servants and maid servants with him in the tomb, because they said they might wait on him, and also a horse, because they said there would be fierce fighting there. And when they wished to have a memorial of the dead man, they ripped open the belly of a horse and pulled out all the flesh without bones, and then they burnt the intestines and bones and sewed up the skin of the horse as though it had its whole body. Having sharpened a great pole, they thrust it in the belly and pulled it out through the mouth, and thus they raised it up on a tree or some elevated place. So in the Judeo-Christian tradition and Islamic tradition, we're used to the idea that, you don't take anything with you into the next realm. But, this is a warrior culture, and your glory that you achieved is tied with your warrior status symbols, your horse, and also the booty and wealth that you've taken. And so they buried them with that, thinking on the idea that, this is theirs, they earned it and deserved it, and they'll take it with them into the next life in some way. And this horse practice at the end, the horse on the pole, there's actually a picture of this that someone took in the early 1900s from this practice still going on from a Western Mongolian tribe called the Oirat. And apparently the idea was that the horse would somehow protect against evil spirits, that would harm the dead person, something to that effect. So Kirakos, as I said, he learned their language also. And here he actually gives a word list and talks about the Mongolian language. And again, it's one of the earliest sources on written sources on the Mongolian language. So he says, but their speech also is barbarous and unknown to us. For they called the name of God Tangri, and man Ere Haran, and woman Eme Apci, and the name of father Echka, brother Aga, like Turkish Aga, and sister Akanc̒, and head Diron, eyes Nidun, ears Chikin. So we don't have to go through all of these, obviously. But for any Turkish speakers or those of you who know Turkish, you'll recognize a lot of similarities. So I think bread is something like ekmek, or I don't see where it is, otmak here. So he says, these were their names for anything, which for many years were unknown to us, but have now been taught us against our will, when he was forced to be their secretary. And their principal leaders who were set over the rest are as follows. The first great one, who was chief and commander of all the forces, Tormalun Nuin, a just and righteous man, and those who were his colleagues, Isra Nuin, Rutun Nuin, Tutun Nuin, and Chagatai, who was the commander of the army, who was killed by the Mulhead. These are the assassins. And there were many other chiefs and troops without number. So here you have a couple of interesting episodes and examples from two historians contemporary with the Mongols, which shows the depth of and kind of intensity of Armenian engagement with the Mongols. And next time we'll continue kind of along these same lines, looking at some of the other historians of this time period. So look forward to hopefully seeing you all back next time. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Arlen. We have a number of questions in the chat that I will present to you now. So the first is from Avi. Regarding Armenian attempts to convert Mongols, are there any surviving examples of religious texts translated into Mongolian or perhaps some other language for that purpose?
Sorry, I'm muted. Okay, let me just think. I don't know, actually. I bet you there are, probably especially from the Syriac Church of the East, I would imagine. But I actually don't know that. That's a really interesting question.
And our next question is from Christine Dombourian. Do we know why the Mongols accepted Islam rather than Christianity?
I think people who know this period of history probably do. I wish I knew more about this period of history, but a lot of it's new to me too. It could be the case that it probably had a lot to do with political reasons. So in that part of the world, especially where the Mongols were most engaged with, Islam was the dominant religion if you look at political rule. And so it's probably one of those cases where it kind of made sense to go with them. So the Mongols didn't have, really strong religious convictions of their own. They didn't have a kind of exclusive religion that views itself as like the one true religion. And so at a certain point in time, when you're interacting with these exclusivist sort of religions like Christianity and Islam, there's going to be a lot of pressure at you to, pick one and stick with it. And it probably was just the case that it was most expedient and better for the Mongols to pick Islam because that kind of gave them the most support from below in terms of the other local rulers on whom they wanted to have loyalty and alliance to ensure their own like overarching rule. So that's, a political answer, like maybe a religious answer could be something else. But in terms of trying to see it from the historical perspective, that's one way you could look at it.
Thank you. From Matthew Sarkisian, I understand that many of the Christians in the East with whom the Mongols interacted were Nestorian Christians, who were anathematized by the Armenian Church and other churches, and that Mongol converts to Christianity were Nestorian. Did this cause any problems with the Mongols' interaction with Armenians?
Yeah, so I don't think it directly caused major problems, and that's partly because Armenian interactions with the Mongols, while it was very like intense, it wasn't that long. And Armenians were, of course, in like a more desperate sort of situation where, you're not in a position to like, dictate the Mongols, beliefs on certain matters of theology or things like that. You're just going to be really happy if he's Christian and supporting you and like going to help you. And so it's possible if we looked at more sources, we might see that, but I didn't come across that, at least I could say, in like what I was looking at. Avi's question from earlier too about any examples of Mongol rulers who converted to Christianity under the auspices of the Armenian Church, because there was that Mongol practice of like kind of going with the religion of the local people. At least in, I think it's Sumbat's Chronicle or maybe Hetum's text. I'm looking over at where it is on the shelf because I was reading it earlier. There's an episode where Hetum is at the Mongol court talking with Mongol Khan, and at least according to the text, he baptizes him, or like has the Khan baptized. I'm not sure, like, did that actually happen, or is he trying to, show in the text to make sure like everyone knows, this Mongol is like really a Christian and not just a Christian, but like an Armenian style Christian. But it is possible because, like I said, the Mongols they do seem to have been very open to like the religious practices of other peoples and willing to just kind of take on what they saw others doing and what they viewed as like expedient to their own political purposes.
The next question, so you touched on this one by Avi about the Mongol policy involving local rulers converting to the local religion and whether there were any examples. So the next one we have is from Christine. Are there any Chinese historians who wrote about their collaboration with the Armenians?
No, so maybe I was a little unclear about that, but there wasn't necessarily, at least I don't think at that time, like direct contact between an Armenian person over here and a Chinese person over here. What I was trying to show was the way that so Armenians adopted these Chinese styles, but that was probably because Chinese goods and artifacts were flowing along the Silk Road, thanks to the Mongolian economic and administrative production, like all the way as far as Cilicia in the Middle East. And so I think it's more that you're experimenting and playing with styles from other cultures that you see around, rather than like in Armenian and Chinese, people getting together and talking and sharing things. So it's more that like, just like, today you could get really into Japanese culture or, watch, Japanese anime things or read books like that. You might not have a single Japanese friend, but it's accessible and available to you because of like the media and things that are available. So the Pax Mongolica and the trade routes and everything that was going on allowed this like vast accessibility of culture across space during this time.
And from Conrad, we have are there any traces of the legend about Prester John and his kingdom in Armenian sources?
Yeah, there are. I came across something with that, but there is, Conrad. I'll have to check back at what I was reading. There's some figure or episode like in one of these Armenian texts or histories from this time that scholars connect with Prester John, but I'm blanking right now on what it was.
And another question from Matthew. In Vartan's work, does he say what exactly Arkavun means to the Mongols? That is, why do they call Christians that?
Yeah, I don't remember if he does. And in my own kind of initial curiosity of that, I looked it up very briefly and didn't really see exactly what the literal meaning would be, but that would be interesting to know.
And from Avi, we have this comment. Tangri is quite close to the old Turkic term Tengri, a term for God as well. Turkish and Mongolian are actually related both within the Altaic language family.
Yes, exactly.
And the last question we have is from Matthew. How long was Kirakos with them as secretary / prisoner?
Yeah, I think it was, more than months, like maybe even up to a year plus, but I'd have to look back exactly to find out. But, as you could see, like enough time to learn a decent amount of the language and all these different, linguistic realms like religion, familial, food, like all these sorts of things. So a fairly decent amount of time.
Please join me in thanking Dr. Arlen for another wonderful lecture in this series. We look forward to seeing you back here next week. In the meantime, these lectures are uploaded again to the St. Nersess website and to the St. Nersess YouTube channel. I know the first two lectures in this part of the series have already been uploaded, so if you missed either of those, feel free to check them out. Please stay well, stay safe, and we'll see you next week. Good night, everybody.
Thanks, Yavant, and thank you everyone so much for coming. See you next week.
I couldn't find a way to chat Jesse.
You know why he's St. Nersess?
Why is he St. Nersess? Because I think the Prester John isn't so hot.
Oh, okay.
But if you've read 8 of them in the last week.
It's hard to remember which was what.
Where was it?